Finally. Welcome to today's Ethnic Media Services Weekly National Briefing. I'm Pilar Marrero, Associate Editor for Ethnic Media Services, and I am moderating today's briefing. So, President-elect Donald Trump's early cabinet appointments signal that border security and immigration restrictions will be a central focus of his administration. But what does that mean for immigrants and the families of immigrants, for their communities? What could mass deportations look like? And what is the potential effect of some of his policies on legal immigrants and naturalized citizens? In this discussion, immigration experts will break down Trump's immigration priorities and explore the potential consequences for immigrants and the nation as a whole. We are honored to host a stellar panel today, as usual. Our speakers are Jeremy Robbins, he's the Executive Director of the American Immigration Council; Greg Chen, Senior Director of Government Relations for the American Immigration Lawyers Association; Elizabeth Taufa, Policy Attorney and Strategist at the Immigrant Legal Resource Center; and Julia Gelatt, Associate Director of our U.S. Immigration Policy Program, Migration Policy Institute. We ask speakers to speak slowly for interpreters in Spanish, Korean, and Mandarin. And we ask reporters to enter questions in the chat. Our speakers are also encouraged to answer questions in the chat throughout the conference if you can. All right. We will send a video of today's briefing and expanded bios with contact information for each speaker to all participants later today. We are also joined by American Sign Language interpreters. This briefing will be done a little different. It will be a conversation by topic. We'll go around the table and discuss the same topic for 10 minutes, and then we will move on to the next topic. If you want to ask a question, put it in the chat so I can stop and take your question, okay? All right, the topics we'll try to cover today are, I'm gonna list them now so you know what's coming: deportations, border policy, legal immigration, birthright citizenship, federal policy versus state policy, and in particular sanctuary states or cities. And finally, what are the possible legislative changes that we may expect from the new administration? I hope we can get to all of this. Okay, let's start with the first topic, and it's the top topic because it was one of the main priorities that we kept hearing from the president-elect: deportations. Donald Trump has promised mass deportations. There are different things to consider here. How is he going to do this? Will they start with people that have pending orders of deportation or people who are in detention? Do you expect indiscriminate raids in towns or neighborhoods? Or will we go back to the use of local police, workplace raids? Will he be able to use the Alien Enemies Act to facilitate the legal side of deportations? And finally, a very important one, can he get enough resources to deport the number of people he wants to deport? There are so many questions here, and all of you can take any part of it that you want. So let's start with Jeremy. What's your take on this?
Thank you, Pilar, and thank you all for having me. I think it's a hugely important conversation and a good group. And I'll just say, just before answering the question really quickly, on our staff, we have a number of staff who speak Spanish, a number of staff who speak Mandarin. We have staff from Afghanistan, from Ghana, from all sorts of places over the world. And so to the extent we can carry on this conversation in language that's appropriate, would love to do that at any point. In terms of the mass deportation effort, if you think about how we tend to deport people right now, most of the people we deport are already in contact with the government in some way. They're in detention, and then the government just has to go and pick them up. And that's a pretty easy thing to do, though not as easy as you think, because you still have to then figure out a process. Are they allowed to be here? Or should they not be here? You have to figure out how to get them back to a country. Some countries won't take them back. But what we're talking about with a mass deportation is now we have to go and find people in communities. And that requires, if you look at sort of the parts of the government that do that, there are two branches of the Department of Homeland Security that specifically go into communities and find people. And they simply do not have the capacity. One, we don't know where people are. And then it is extremely expensive, and you need a lot of people that we do not currently have on staff to do that. Then when you pick people up, you got to hold them while you figure out whether they should be here. The current detention capacity for immigrants in this country is about 50,000. If you're talking about deporting 13 million people and you only have capacity to detain 50,000 whom we're already detaining, what are you going to do? So you need to build new facilities. You need to, and then you need to have them figure out in the courts, should these people be here or not? Right now, the backlog is more than 1 million cases. It takes about 5 years to figure out if someone should get asylum. So you need a whole new set of judges and asylum officers. Then you need to get people home. And so how are we going to do that? So all of that, if you were going to do it all at once, would cost about $315 billion. And if you were trying to port 1 million people per year, it would be about $88 billion a year. It's about almost $1 trillion over a decade. Where's
Jeremy,
that? So I was just saying,
sorry. Should we get other people
yeah,
in
I'm
the
sorry, sorry.
panel
Well,
chime
yeah,
in? Yes. Greg, do you want to chime in here?
Sure. And good afternoon to everybody. The American Immigration Lawyers Association has 17,000 members across the country that are grappling with what has happened with the elections and the outpouring of interest in supporting people that are now concerned about their legal status. Many have legal status, and many and those who don't, our attorneys are often representing them. Put them at your disposal. Feel free to contact me or communications team if you are looking for talking to an attorney who maybe is representing somebody in the kind of situation that you are writing about. In response to Pilar's question, and thank you again for having me on here, I would first of all I would say three quick things. One is fear and intimidation. Secondly is the lawfulness of what the new administration is going to do. And then finally, just economic impact. So I fully agree with what Jeremy was starting to touch upon there, and that is that enforcement activities that the new administration is planning to do and to ramp up, be it at the border or in the interior, is going to take more resources. The Biden administration has already maximally deployed the existing ICE and CBP resources to do enforcement. They've been quite aggressive in what they are doing. They don't have a lot more personnel to do that. And so they will be limited. But on the fear and intimidation factor, they are counting on the fact that they can instill fear in communities, and that's already happening now. We have attorneys who are calling because people who have legal status are even afraid that they'll be rounded up as well because they'll just be profiled. Those are legitimate concerns in this new environment we are in, and that's why I bring up the lawfulness point. There are requirements of how federal law enforcement act. They need to respect federal laws, including civil rights laws. But the kinds of things the new administration has been saying they're planning to do, including mobilizing National Guard who are not trained on immigration law, that's going to result in more violations of existing federal legal requirements, both in the immigration law space, such as proper screenings for asylum, as well as for civil rights harassment. The final thing I'll just mention, just so we can keep the conversation going, is economic impact. So Jeremy gave out a number there. American Immigration Council has done incredible work in this space trying to estimate. I was just down the southern border in Arizona, in the southwest corner there of Yuma County. They are incredibly dependent on migrant labor for agriculture. The businesses there are very concerned about making sure that labor needs are able to be met. We are going to see devastation across the country of businesses and industries in just about every economic sector. And that is something that is not going to be good for the country. And I would say to the new administration, that would not be a smart policy for them to be pushing forward, since economy was apparently the most important thing to voters. I'll stop there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Greg. Liz Taufa from LRC, what's your take on this part of our topic?
Thanks for having us. My name is Liz Taufa. I'm from the ILRC. We're a San Francisco-based nonprofit, but I work in our DC office on federal policy. I just want to drill down a little bit on what Greg and Jeremy both brought up, and that's the effect on the communities of mass deportation. I think that there's this narrative of trucks moving through communities and people, house raids, workplace raids, and all of that's very, very real. But I think we do also need to talk about the effect in the community, not just the economic effect on the communities, but the emotional and psychological effect on communities. I mean, I think as Jeremy was making the point is that the federal government does not have the resources to put a mass deportation scheme that was talked about on the campaign trail into effect, but the fear and intimidation campaign is working currently and will continue to work. And there's obviously the economic impacts. There are various sectors that will fold without immigrant labor, but there's also the impact on communities and the emotional well-being of communities. I mean, these are family members, church members, fellow church members, co-workers, people's kids go to school, and like, what does mass deportation look like on a community level? It looks like kids that aren't going to school because their parents are afraid of being deported. It looks like shortages of healthcare workers because people either move to states that are a little bit safer or they are removed from the country. And it looks like fewer teachers. There are a lot of folks here on temporary status like CPS and DACA who are teachers, and we are already facing a teacher shortage. So, I mean, I think that, that's a piece that really needs to be talked about more, is the fact that it's not just the economic effect. It's not just the fact that that they can't afford to do this. It's the unraveling of the threads of our American communities. And this is going to hit rural communities a lot harder than it is going to hit urban communities. So that's just like one of the main points I wanted to make, but I'll stop there.
Thank you, Liz. I want to bring in Julia Gelatt from MPI to add to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here with all of you. The Migration Policy Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. We're based here in Washington, D.C., do research and analysis on a wide range of issues. I completely agree with everything that my co-panelists said. Just to kind of put a point on the numbers and the resources, we've heard on the campaign trail threats of deporting all of the unauthorized immigrants in the country, or 1 million a year. In the highest year of deportations from the interior of the United States, that was in 2009, there were 238,000 deportations. So, it would take, as other panelists have mentioned, a huge infusion of resources, increased staff, increased detention facilities, increased immigration court proceedings, more planes, more buses to really scale that up. It is quite hard to imagine getting to the kind of scale that's been threatened. But as Liz mentioned, just the noise around it can cause people to be afraid. So I think it is really important, that we put some bounds around this, and that we all be realistic about what's known, what's not known, and what might be possible. There are some tools that the incoming Trump administration could use to try to increase the scope. They could use a quick removal process called expedited removal more. It's hard to know exactly how that could be carried out, or the exact legality of how that could be carried out. And then I think, as Liz mentioned and others mentioned, we'll see this play out really unevenly across localities. One of the reasons is that because most deportations tend to happen of people who have had involvement with local law enforcement, whether they committed a major crime or they were caught driving without a license in a state where licenses aren't available to them. The policies that local jurisdictions have about cooperating with ICE become very important. And shout out to ILRC, which has a terrific map of different state and county policies on whether or not local law enforcement honors ICE detainers, holds people additional time just to transfer them to ICE. That can really shape the level of deportations in a community that come through local law enforcement. So we may see red states having higher levels of people who are transferred to ICE, to federal agents, and deported then in blue states where they have these non-cooperation policies. So there are things that states and localities can do, and we may see the effects play out quite unevenly. And, and across the workforce as well, about 5% of our workforce is unauthorized immigrants, but much more in some industries.
Slow down for interpreters, please.
Sorry about that.
Yes.
Yeah, so yeah, I can leave it there for this.
All right. Yes, the conversation will be available later by video as every week. All right. So, Jeremy, you were talking before about the money, and you were about to make a point. And I guess it comes down to, he's going to have Congress, he's going to have the House, he's going to have the Senate. Do you don't think it's possible that he'll get enough money to ramp up this deportation machine?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So, and Greg really is the expert here, so I'll leave it to him. But I'll say this, that they'll have Congress, but for most things that Congress is going to fund, they'll need 60 votes in the Senate, with the exception of the reconciliation process, which they only get to do once a year. So right now, they're doing the fiscal year budget, and that will lock up money at current levels, likely until next fall, till next September. So the biggest opportunity to fund with new money would be through the reconciliation process, where you only need 50 votes. It is far from clear that they will be able to do that. They will have lots of priorities in that time. The one other way they could do it would be to repurpose money from elsewhere. There's been talk about using the military or other forms, and so it is very possible. It is just challenging, and I'll stop.
Thank you so much. Anyone else wants to make a comment about this? Greg, maybe? The money?
Yeah, happy to. And so Jeremy kind of touched upon the critical points there. I think it will be difficult for the new administration coming in to be able to get appropriations at the level that they would require to do vastly increased deportations. And it will also take time to hire up. And in fact, meaning immigration enforcement officers, both within ICE and CBP. The fact is that Customs and Border Protection has not been able to hire the number of Border Patrol officers, agents that they are already authorized and appropriated to do, because they can't find adequate and qualified personnel. So that's an additional obstacle to what they can accomplish. So I think they were going to be looking to state and local and National Guard type resources to do much of what they're trying to do. Detention is another important topic. It takes time to be able to stand up the kinds of facilities and bring them online. I imagine they will be looking to the private contracting facilities, things such as Geo Corporation or Congressional Corporation of America, to do that. That will take time to execute those kinds of contracts. There'll be delays there. But ultimately, whether Congress will give them that scale of money we are talking about vastly increased, like several times the existing budget. Already, DHS law enforcement budget exceeds every other federal law enforcement agency's budget combined together. So that is something that's going to be hard for them to get bipartisan support across the board.
Thank you. We're going to move on to talk a little bit about the border. And I imagine that we all expect a rush to the border between now and January 20th, when the new president takes over. And then when he takes over, a slowdown on the process, right? So which probably won't last, because immigration is not really has anything to do with the president. It has to do with other forces out there. So Trump tried to close the borders, and he was stopped by the courts. So will he invoke Title 42 again? Will he try to keep people in Mexico again? What do you all expect to see in terms of border policy? And let's call to anyone wants to volunteer for this one?
I can start and welcome others to jump in after that. I mean, right now, what the policy is that people arriving at official crossing points on the border at ports of entry can make an appointment and wait several months to be processed into United States with a temporary status called humanitarian parole. But people who come between those crossing points and try to enter have a very hard time qualifying for beginning the process towards asylum unless they meet certain exceptions. I think under President Trump, we can expect that those exceptions will be taken away, that it will be very hard for people to access asylum proceedings if they come to the border. And also that the CBP-1 appointment process at ports of entry will be ended, meaning it will be very difficult for people coming to the border to be able to enter the country and start the process of asking for protection. Instead, what we'll likely see, because this is what we've seen before, is that people pay smugglers to sneak them all the way across the border into the United States, rather than getting them to the border, where right now many people present themselves to border authorities and ask for protection. I do think that people around the world might believe that coming under President Trump is a worse time to come than they thought it was to come under President Biden. So we might see fewer people even attempting the trip just because of the rhetoric.
Someone else? Anyone else? Jeremy, Greg, Liz?
Yeah, I can jump in just to add to what Julia was saying. I mean, I think that, over the last few years, we've seen so many changes on the way asylum seekers are treated at the southern border by the Biden administration. And, I think that it'll be interesting to see, and, I'm not a fortune teller, so I don't know exactly what he'll do, but it'll be interesting to see what vestiges remain of the Biden administration policies on the border and whether they'll take them down completely, or just work within them. A lot of the things that we've seen the Biden administration do on asylum at the border mirrored a lot of what we saw with, it wasn't quite Title 42, it wasn't quite Remain in Mexico, but as Julia mentioned, you need an appointment to seek asylum now, and if you don't have one, you're summarily removed. And so, we're back to talking about border walls, we're back to talking about people staying in Mexico, but that's already kind of the reality, and the infrastructure that has been built over the course of the last few administrations is still very much alive. So there's really kind of an on-ramp already available for the Trump administration to come in and reestablish even harsher penalties and really further decimate the asylum system than what we've already seen. So yeah.
Pilar, I would just add one other point, which is the expansion of blocks or bans on people to be able to enter based on categories. So we saw this happen in the first Trump administration with the Muslim ban, of which we had several iterations, and the use of an authority under the Immigration Nationality Act, 212F, enables the president to suspend entry for certain categories that he might define under his discretion. The president could say certain categories of individuals are threats to the country across a wide range of rhetorical tools, such as they're criminals, they're terrorists, rhetoric he's already used. Those would likely be challenged in courts, but the Supreme Court has given latitude and has interpreted 212F more broadly than Ayla thinks is legitimate under the law. But I anticipate that the new administration will do this and could identify people and block people based on a wide range of categories, including countries they're coming from, appearance, what their languages they speak, and I'm concerned that will also lead to things such as race, ethnic, religious profiling, and categorical use that does violate the law.
I'm going to read a question that's in the chat in the interest of time by Henrietta Burrows. She says, wouldn't all these needed expenditures for mass deportation increase the budget deficit, bring about unemployment, increase inflation, and undermine the economic improvements Trump says he wants to bring about? Anyone want to jump in on that one?
Yeah, I'd love to if it's okay.
Okay.
It's a fabulous question, Henrietta, and I think so when the cost of mass deportation would be tremendous, not just because it's so expensive to deport people, but because, as you suggest, it would wreak havoc on the economy. By conservative estimates, deporting 13 million people who are over 4% of the workforce and working in really critical industries would have between a 4.2 and 6.8% negative impact on our GDP, on our gross domestic product. That's in line with the Great Recession. Conversely, the last time there was a big bill in Congress in 2013 to reform our immigration laws and give people a path to legal status, the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office found that it would have a positive impact of $900 billion over 20 years because it would bring in more taxpayers, more consumers, and grow our economy.
Okay, there's a question here by Renee. Pomona, California is 80% Hispanic. I have no idea how many are undocumented, meaning they are not citizens of this country. Do you believe that Trump will go after every Hispanic who is not legally living here? and probably not just Hispanic. Do you really believe he'll go? I mean, we're talking about resources again. How they're going to do that. So I guess, yeah, it comes down to that. Anyone? Yeah, it's about resources, right? Anyone?
I mean, I think it's also about priorities. The Biden administration has a priorities and enforcement priorities memo that I think a lot of other administrations have had, where they establish who is a priority for removal. And certainly during the last Trump administration, we saw the removal of that priorities memo, but still there are priorities, right? They're going to start, I think, as somebody mentioned earlier, they're going to start with folks that are already in detention, folks that are being transferred to ICE from state and local carceral systems. And so, I mean, their priorities will be there. So, I mean, I think that the difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration is that the Biden administration had their enumerated priorities. The Trump administration wants everyone to know that everyone is fair game. They may be going after specific people, but if they find you at the same time, they're going to pick you up. And I think that's part of that fear campaign. But sorry, I jumped in front of you, Greg.
No, go ahead. No, that's the way it's supposed to be. It's a conversation. So let's move on to another topic. I was thinking about legal immigration and people who are in some kind of temporary status. We know that during his first term, Donald Trump canceled DACA. We know that DACA is hanging in the balance in the courts as well right now because of lawsuits by the Republicans. He also canceled TPS, which is a temporary protective status. Most of these actions, when they were done by the Trump administration, were undone by the Biden administration, which also gave temporary status to other nationalities like Venezuelans, for example. And we also have to consider business visas and temporary visas that are so crucial for many industries. What's your take? And let's go around. Let's go to Jeremy, and then let's go to each of you. What's your take on what's going to happen with this?
Look, I mean, I think if the Trump administration repeats what it did last time, it is going to be made much more difficult for immigrants of all types. And it's going to be done in a bunch of different ways. It is going to be done with sort of direct types of bans. Remember, we saw Muslim bans and then from different countries. It's going to be done by choking off numbers like refugees. It's going to be done by making it harder to get asylum. And then it's going to be done in much smaller ways. One thing that happened was there were huge increases in what's called requests for evidence. So it became much harder and more difficult. They expanded the requirements to get basically every single type of visa. And then there was a real push with attrition through staff. At the end of the Trump administration, USCIS, which administers the immigration system, was only 81% staffed, meaning 1 out of every 5 jobs was empty. And so the backlogs got tremendous and it got hard. And I think we'll see that and more.
Well, anyone else wants to chime in on this one?
Yeah, I would like to. So I'm glad that this is a topic in this session because there's so much focus given in the news right now because the president has been talking so much about the mass deportations and border that people rarely hear about the dramatic and hugely systematic impacts on the legal immigration system, meaning employment-based visas, family-based visas, and also humanitarian visas that are typically processed through U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, but also with a large role played by Department of Labor and Department of State. This is to process the hundreds of thousands of people that are coming through every year into our country. During the first Trump administration, within the first year, AILA started seeing reports through of just about every category of application across the different topics I mentioned before. We're seeing what we refer to technically as retrogression, which simply means it is taking a lot longer to process a case. So if you are petitioning for a family member to come here, that might typically take for a spouse or maybe a child 3 to 6 months. We're seeing those times typically double. Same thing with employment-based visas. And employers were anxious as all get out because they couldn't fill jobs. This brings us back to the economic impact, but we're also talking about the health of the American community and American society by shutting down the legal immigration system. Jeremy mentioned one kind of example, the request for evidence, which is simply a way of asking for more information on a case. It is an officer that is reviewing a case that is typically given specific instructions, but also some discretion as to how much to probe into a particular case. Under the first Trump administration, the RFE was one kind of a tool, but it was one of many kinds of tools that could be used to ferret out fraud or national security concerns. But if it is used too aggressively and unnecessarily, it simply becomes red tape thrown at anybody who's trying to get processed through the system. That is going to hurt our country tremendously. And if the discretion is taken away from officers who are already trying their best, essentially to make sure that you don't let in somebody who's going to pose a danger to the country or who's just committing fraud, you're going to see that immigration is unavailable to people who are legitimately trying to come here and go through the legal means. And what you'll see is greater amounts as a result of irregular migration coming into the country.
Let me bring in one of the questions in the chat by Thomas Bunn. He says, a theory being touted on social media is if you hire Americans to assist in the immigration crisis, quote unquote, that redirects federal tax dollars to people who need jobs and government contracts. This satisfies the America First initiative, implying that in blah, blah, blah. Okay, so is this something that's doable? Just using this as a a jobs program for Americans? I mean, we already have very low unemployment anyway.
Right, we have very low unemployment. I think if we're going to have government jobs programs, there might be more constructive things to do. We still need to work on our infrastructure in this country. There are things that could better set us up for the future. We also are in an aging country. So the number of working age people who are US born is no longer growing. So even if we do the really important work that we need to do to help more people, more Americans get back into the labor market, that still is not going to be enough in the years ahead to grow our labor force. We really need immigrants who tend to come in at working ages to keep growing our labor force. And when we lose immigrant workers, it doesn't necessarily create jobs for US workers. If an employer is reliant on immigrant workers and they lose those immigrant workers, they might contract their operation or close up shop altogether. And then the US born workers that they also employ will lose their jobs. So I think it's important to remember that immigrants and US workers are complements in the labor force. I also wanted to talk about, you raised the DACA holders and temporary protected status holders. And there's now a lot of people who have humanitarian parole. So just a lot of people in the United States who have temporary legal protections and work authorization. And we know that President Trump in the past, as you mentioned, has moved to end these programs. This can also be really disruptive for America's employers. Most employers want to hire a legal workforce, and if their workers lose work authorization, they'll have to let them go. This will be really disruptive to our economy, and it's also likely that people who rely on work authorization documents will see more disruptions to their employment if the Trump administration is slower to process applications, as others have mentioned, and if they maybe shorten the work authorization periods. The Biden administration has made them longer to try to help keep people employed, even as the government looks at applications slowly. If those work authorization periods get shrunk again, we could see people churning in and out of employment, even if they're legally here and legally authorized to work.
There's another question here from EMS Associate Editor Peter Sherman. What do small business owners who employ undocumented workers need to think about in this new administration? It's interesting. Small or big? I mean, workplace rates, are we going to see stuff like that, Greg?
Sure. Well, first of all, employing people who are undocumented is not lawful employment activity. I imagine the population of employers that might be doing that, which we know exists in the United States, are aware of that already. But that is, they are liable in terms of business practices for doing that. So putting that issue aside, I think employers who are in that situation need to be prepared that people who are undocumented already are going to be making sure that they are safe and protected because they will be at increased risk, even if it is not going to be across the board raids in every community all the time. I think the likelihood that that will happen is going to drive people to change or avoid possibility of their own risk. So I think employers should be concerned about what will happen to the undocumented work population in the upcoming months, especially after the new administration comes in and begins to work this mechanism. Raids take a huge amount of resources to deploy. Planning, typically by Immigration Customs Enforcement, such as Fugitive Operations Unit, but there will not be raids happening in every community, at least not by Immigration Customs Enforcement all that soon, just because of the amount of resources taken. What we could see happening is, as I mentioned before, the use of more state and local law enforcement, as well as possibly National Guard that the president-elect on the campaign trail has talked about. My concern about those activities is that they will not be the people that are transacting those, executing those kinds of activities, won't have training on immigration law or even federal legal requirements, which is the domain for immigration enforcement. So we're likely to see local law enforcement or other actors violate U.S. law, and I think that will create a greater environment of chaos within our communities, including for businesses.
Okay, there's a bunch of questions here. Rosana Huang had a couple of questions. Let me ask one of them. She says, how will immigration law will be impacted by tax reform in 2025? I'm not sure. Does it make sense? I'm not sure what that means. Yeah.
Well, I can talk about that. I mean,
Okay.
it's impacted by tax reform in the sense it's going to impact the deficit, right? If there's another major tax cut, that will have a hugely negative impact on, or it will grow our deficit. And at the same time, if you are implementing the immigration policies that have been promised in Project 2025 and on the campaign trail, those will also increase the deficit. And it'll mean that we'll have to borrow more, and that will also spike inflation. And inflation, of course, very much the driving impact issue of this election. And so if you see inflation with other policies that are talked about that could also have that impact, plus the labor, that could have that could create a perfect storm for American consumers.
There's a comment in the chat also that I think it's relevant. The countries that they'll send the immigrants back to will have to agree, and most of them won't be able to handle the flow of immigrants back. I'm thinking of Mexico. Mexico is a country that will be very affected because, of course, they're next door, and there's a lot of Mexican undocumented people, about 5 million that they more or less appreciate. What do you think? What do you think that this will look like in terms of relationships with countries like Mexico? I don't know, Liz or anyone?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, on one side, what we'll see is longer periods of detention for folks that are detained as they wait to be removed if they can't be removed by ICE. And I also think that, I think that Jeremy sort of touched on this a little bit too, is that the relationships that we have, the foreign policy, immigration is obviously not separate from foreign policy. And so to do further damage to those relationships, especially when we're coupling this with talk of tariffs and other things that are going to make other countries mad, I think that it just is going to compound the problem and also compound the reluctance of other countries to accept back folks that the U.S. wants to return.
Yeah, I'm talking about, yeah, go for it.
Just to build upon what Liz was saying there, Mexico has played an absolutely critical role in managing migration not only of people, its own nationals in the United States, but people that are passing through Mexico, because that is our southwest border. And if the Mexican government is no longer cooperative, that will pose tremendous challenges if people from other nationalities, of which you name it, it's about 15, 20 different nationalities on any given day that might be crossing in through a port of entry or irregularly. That is going to be much more difficult for the administration to manage if they don't get that kind of cooperation. And so that's a very specific kind of example of how multilateral, bilateral relationships are going to be very important. And this administration is approaching that question with a sledgehammer and not diplomacy. So I think that is a very real concern. The other thing I just want to flag is the discussion we've had here, I think, should really point to one very clear conclusion for those of you listening in, which is that the mass deportation plan is primarily a shock and awe intimidation plan. We will certainly see it happening in highlighted areas, but to be able to operationalize it at the scale that is being touted is functionally impossible and will cripple the country in economic terms. But Liz had mentioned detention. There is not capacity to detain the number of people. They won't be able to stand that up. So it is mostly a shock and awe, smoke and mirrors kind of approach. It will have an impact in terms of deterrence, scaring people from either coming here or scaring them into the shadows.
There's a couple of questions by my colleague Sunita regarding temporary work visas. And she says, during the first Trump administration, the scope of qualifications for an H-1B visa were greatly narrowed. Do you expect that to continue? Will the H-4 visas for spouses be thrown out? And also H-2 visas for agricultural workers may be dropped? Do you think any of this is going to happen? That this would fall into the legislative changes, or can he do stuff like this administratively?
Hi, Jeremy, you want to take that?
Greg, go ahead, please.
Okay, so it can be done. Congress can certainly pass new laws that put limits on H-1B on the program. I think it'd be very difficult to get any kind of immigration legislation passed in the upcoming Congress, even though they have both chambers under their Republican control. The margins are small. The executive branch has a great deal of discretion and operational authority in terms of how they administer these programs. This goes back to what I was talking about before with respect to essentially throwing sand in the gears. Here we are talking about the USCIS agency and just making it much more difficult for H-1B petitions to be granted. And so they may not say they are shutting it down officially, but they will make it far more difficult and make it a much longer process for any employer that is going through this process, and that will cripple the operation or could potentially do it.
Many more questions coming in. Yes, go ahead.
So I was just going to add, I think it's important to note that some of the changes that can be made without Congress would survive legal challenges better if they're made through the regulatory process. So we might expect some changes like removing work authorization from spouses of H-1B holders to happen through the regulatory process, which means it will happen more slowly. In the last Trump administration, they tried to make many changes through executive action, but then there was successful litigation to say they hadn't gone through the right government procedures to make those changes. They might try that again, but it seems like they may have learned the lesson that they should take some time and implement some of these changes in a more durable way through the regulatory process, which means everyone will have more advance notice that these changes are coming.
I wanted to go into the issue of, the federal government versus different states, right? So one of the questions in the chat, can you speak about the differences in these policies depending on the states where people live? Henrietta mentions, Governor Newsom is already gearing up to fight some of the policies. We heard the selected border czar, Tom Homan, say, well, we don't care about sanctuary states. We don't care about sanctuary cities. We're just going to go in. How do you expect this back and forth between the federal government and some of the states like California, for example?
Yeah, if I may, so I think those are great questions. And I think what's really interesting and important about those questions is both what the federal government will do and also what they won't do. And so just starting with what they probably will not do, there have been a rise in states trying to take over at least part of the federal government's responsibility to enforce immigration law. So you've seen it in Florida, you've seen it in Iowa, you've seen it in Oklahoma. There are several states that have passed laws that let local police try and enforce immigration laws. Those laws have so far been held up mostly in the courts. In Florida and in Iowa, courts have stayed those laws, and in Iowa, that's up on appeal right now. In a Trump administration, you can pretty much guarantee that the federal government would not fight those laws. And so that allows people who live in states with governors, and legislatures that are hostile to immigration to pass very, very draconian laws. In terms of, you mentioned, if you look at Project 2025, there are a lot of ideas that would directly impact people living in states that are friendly to immigrants, inclusive of states that have passed in-state tuition to help undocumented students go to college. And there's the suggestion in Project 2025 of withholding federal funds for any state that does that. And then the last thing I'll say on the states is that many states during the last Trump administration that are friendly towards immigrants and wanted to defend immigrants, started putting up money and other resources to help immigrants. And so there will be the big discrepancy between immigrants who live in states like that and immigrants who live in states that don't have those resources.
I have a question that seems very interesting. There are all of these this is from Seema Gupta. There are all of these green card holders, temporary and permanent residents, who, despite their eligibility, don't take up U.S. citizenship. They continue to stay in the country illegally. What will happen to these people? Will Trump make green cards termed out and citizenship mandatory? I don't know. Who knows?
I think that's a great question. I can jump in on that one. So I don't think that we would ever see the Trump administration make citizenship mandatory. That would be really interesting if they did. For permanent residents, once you have lawful permanent residence, you have it forever. It is permanent. You do need to renew your actual physical green card every 10 years. And so we might see, we talked a little bit about adjudication delays at USCIS. We could see, significant adjudication delays there. I think we would actually see the opposite, where there are, chilling effects on naturalization to discourage people to naturalize. So when they ramp up denaturalization tactics, that's a way to sort of chill and scare people to not naturalize. I think that we see it a lot in USCIS adjudications, a really deep dive by adjudicators looking for fraud, even when there has been no indication of fraud in any previous application. By the time you get to naturalization, you have gone through 2, 3, many iterations of other statuses to get on the pathway to naturalization and then eventually to naturalization. So I think that, we probably wouldn't see any encouragement to naturalize from the Trump administration, but we could see the opposite, where they try to reduce the numbers of people who are looking to naturalize and making it harder and throwing up more barriers, financial barriers. So raising the fee for naturalization, making the interview and English and civics test harder. I think we're much more likely to see that.
I wanted to talk about this whole idea of what is called birthright citizenship, because this is it's been the agenda of the restrictionists for many, many years. But Trump has also mentioned that he wants to make the children born in the U.S. of undocumented immigrants not get citizenship. Is this doable? I guess it's more complicated than one may think, right? I mean, it's a constitutional change. Who wants to jump in?
I can talk about this. So the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment guarantees citizenship to anyone who is born in this country. The case law is exceptionally clear on it, dating back to the 19th century. In the case of United States v. Wong Kim Ark in 1898. So you would need one of two things to happen. Either you would need a constitutional amendment, and you'd need 2/3 of the states to do that, or you would need a drastic change in Supreme Court jurisprudence where the Supreme Court would overrule the case from 1898. That's certainly possible, and there are a lot of folks that are trying hard to do that. The president could not do it unilaterally, nor could Congress do it without a constitutional amendment. But that is a huge aim. The other one is about whether schools have to educate undocumented children. And there's a very clear case law from 1982 in Plyler versus Doe. That's where the Supreme Court said the answer is yes, but there is a very concerted effort to undermine that and to try and overturn that jurisprudence as well.
Okay, I got a press release yesterday, and it's 139 immigrant, civil, and human rights organizations urge President Biden to take swift action to protect immigrant communities. They want President Biden to, before he leaves, to protect dreamers, TPS holders, and other longtime residents from mass deportation and family separation, etc. What do you all think President Biden could do that would make sense? Because he can just do something that will get undue later. So what will make sense for this administration to do before January 20th? Anyone?
I can go up. No, sounds good. But Greg, you can go.
So, yeah, happy to answer that question. The Biden administration only has a couple of months left before they're out of office, but there are significant steps they can still do. Finalizing regulations that are already in motion would be extremely valuable and helpful. And there are a number of regulations that are already part of the federal regulatory process that would improve let's say, adjudication of adjustment applications, the operation of programs such as the H-1B program. Those are all ones that if they could be completed, because they've already gone through significant steps of the regulatory process, it would require the Trump administration to go through a process that's just more time consuming, a similar regulatory process to take that down. They can't just do that by executive order. So that is one thing that we'd emphasize. We would also ask that the Biden administration look at still on the books Trump era policies and regulations, here particularly regulations that were not actually put into effect, that should be finally withdrawn and rescinded. And I'll give you an example. There is a standing regulation that has never been implemented by the Biden administration that makes it much more difficult for a judge to grant a continuance in a removal case, in a deportation case before that judge. If somebody doesn't have an attorney yet and needs more time to find an attorney, frequently that will be found to be good cause for a judge to grant a continuance. The Trump administration actually, through their attorneys general first, just by certification authority, a rare power of the attorney general, but then later on through this regulation that the Trump administration put forth, tried to make it much more difficult for a judge to find good cause. The Biden administration should simply rescind that particular regulation, so the incoming administration can't simply turn on the light switch and get that going. So those are the two kinds of actions that we would recommend.
Okay, somebody's bringing up again the Muslim ban. I think you guys talked about this before. These were the security bans, right? And we've heard before from experts saying he may expand that to include other groups. Do you think this is likely to happen? Anyone? Julia?
Yeah, I think that, travel bans is something that the last Trump administration used successfully. It took them multiple tries to satisfy the Supreme Court in their justification of why they passed the so-called Muslim ban. It was, justified on the grounds that we weren't getting good security vetting information from these countries, but the Supreme Court also sort of deferred to the executive branch on making that judgment. So I think that we could see travel bans justified on security grounds. We also saw during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, the Trump administration implemented very wide bans on in-migration of permanent immigrants and temporary workers on economic grounds. And we're not in a recession like we were briefly during the COVID pandemic, but given things that the Trump campaign has said about the economy, I could see them trying to justify travel bans on other grounds. It's not something that they've been saying very much, but I do think that they have shown their interest in using these to try to block people from coming, and that's something to look out for.
Okay, I'm going to take another question here. How likely is it that the Trump administration will target immigrants in California because of its open confrontation with Governor Newsom? I think that's the thing. Will it be easier just to go to the friendly governors and just deport people there?
I agree with what you just said there, Pilar. And to restate it, I think it will be much easier for the incoming administration to partner with states, with governors and leadership that are going to be more inclined in terms of the Trump agenda. So that's typically red states. Texas, for example, Florida, Arizona could also do that. And I think it's less likely they'll target a state like California, the particular migrants there, because there will be less cooperation from those state and local law enforcement. Federal authorities across the board tend to partner with local law enforcement, such as identifying people who may not have legal status by screening people that are currently in jails. Most states do participate in that, but to varying degrees. So it'd be harder to do that in a state like California. I think if there's a question here before about targeting sanctuary cities and funding. I think it is very possible that the new administration would try to restrict funding for a variety of federal funding programs across the board, not just in the immigration space, in order to be punitive and exact essentially political revenge against those states.
Okay.
In the first Trump administration, we saw some kinds of immigration enforcement at large arrests, so arrests by ICE that happen at people's homes or workplaces or in between. We saw that targeted a bit at sanctuary cities, but those are very expensive, resource-intensive arrests. So even though they were targeted at so-called sanctuary cities, the numbers weren't necessarily very large, but that was a goal or a strategy that was announced in the last Trump administration.
Okay, I wanted to close because we have 3 minutes. Go back to a question by Oni Advincula, who said, what actions can we take to prepare and inform our communities in these situations? So tell us one thing that we as ethnic media can do other than just holding these events. What else can we do to really inform our communities about what's coming, especially those of us who cover immigrant communities? Let's start with Jeremy.
Okay. I'll just say very, very briefly, and thank you for having me on. The media plays just about the most important role here because this is an issue where there is misinformation absolutely everywhere, and there's so much fear, and that is going to drive the whisper campaign, and people are going to believe the worst. And so just really clear-eyed explanations of what is happening, who is impacted, what it means is going to be absolutely essential because people are going to assume the worst and they're going to be scared and they're not going to know that. So I think that is a hugely important role that everyone on this call plays.
Let's see, who else? Liz, wanna?
Yeah, just similar to Jeremy's point, I think it's also really important for media to really, have a line of sight on what's actually happening. I think that in addition to the fear and the chaos that we hear about very consistently from this administration, from the campaign, I think there is a certain amount of deflection and distraction that they're trying to engage in. And so, while we're talking about the ridiculous cabinet appointees, they're doing something behind the scenes that we really need to pay attention to. So if it looks crazy and sounds crazy and is whipping up a bunch of internet memes and whatnot, we have to ask one more question and say, what is it that they don't want us to look at? So disinformation and also cutting through the distraction weeds to get to what's actually happening, I think is going to be really important. And thanks for having us this week.
Thank you so much. Julia?
Yeah, I would just underscore the same points. I think really detailed reporting of what is happening and reporting of what isn't happening can also be really helpful. And I think local media have a really important role to play because something might be happening in one state or city and things might be quite different in another state or city, and people really need to know what's happening right around them. I also think it's important to dig a little bit behind an example. I think sometimes there's reporting on one family that faces something very scary, and it happens that there's something in their history or there's some detail that makes that a very particular case where another family that looks like that might not be in that same situation. So I think just the more detail and the more accuracy in reporting, it's just really important. And thank you for all that you do, and thanks for having me on today.
Thank you. Greg, final word.
Thank you for that question, Pilar. And yes, thanks to everybody for being on this call. It's a very important topic. The one thing I would stress here is perhaps the public service announcement value that all of you can play here. Uh, there are not enough, there's not enough information, guidance for people who are going to be concerned about their legal status, people who are in temporary status, people with green cards may also be afraid, as the questions came up a moment ago. Also, those who are undocumented. There are simply not enough legal immigration attorneys, nonprofit organizations to serve the community. Ayla is looking at how we can build core of people that are lawyers that are willing to assist, but that still will not be enough. What will happen as a result is that people will prey upon that lack of knowledge, and to the extent that you can inform the public about notarios, people who are not licensed to practice law, and I use that term in a negative phrase, even though being a notario is not necessarily negative automatically, but it is a term for people who are going to scam somebody and say, you can apply for this, give me all this money, but it goes nowhere. And it also may jeopardize that person's status. To make sure that you vet people that you talk to and put that information out there so that people don't unwittingly get duped by somebody who is doing wrong.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all the great information to our panelists and for their time. And thank you for all the amazing questions from our colleagues, and have a good weekend.